Welcome to Lesson 2.3a, Preterit Tense Part 3. In Part 3, we're going to examine some irregular verbs that I refer to as category verbs, meaning they all fall into a certain pattern. While there are technically 4 category verbs, we're going to focus in on category U, category UV, and category I. So it's important to remember what the preterite tense is. In Spanish, we have 2 ways of expressing the past, and the preterite is one of those ways. The preterite is known as the simple past tense when we add ed to the end of an English verb. So it's used in certain situations, such as completed actions, one-time actions, the beginning or end of an action, interruptions, changes in emotion, specific time frames, and those are the preterite-specific usages in the past. Now, we are going to eventually learn the imperfect, which has some other specific uses. Okay, so let's look at the regular and irregular conjugations. We've already learned how to conjugate normal AR, ER, and IR verbs. We also know that there are special yo forms when we encounter a verb that ends in car, gar, or zar. And that's to be able to maintain the spelling, the sound and the spelling to maintain the sound. So our endings for normal, regular AR, ER, IR verbs are aste o, amos astes arron, iste io, imos istes ieron. We also learned that there are 5 main irregular verbs, and that the irregular verbs hold no accent marks. Ser and ir happen to share conjugations. Fui, fuiste, fue, fuimos, fuisteis, fueron. Ver and dar are also extremely similar, where just the V and the D are the only difference between the two. Vi, viste, vio, vimos, vistes, vieron. And dar, didiste dio, dimos distes dieron. Hacer is kind of an oddball in that it doesn't really follow any of the patterns. It changes to an I, it has a Z, and those irregular forms become ise, hiciste, hizo, hicimos, hicistes, hicieron. So that's the part of the preterite that we already know. But there are more irregulars. These irregulars are called category verbs, and while there are technically 4 types of category verbs, we're going to focus in on the first 3, category U, category UV, and category I. Now these verbs undergo an irregular spelling in the main part of the verb, and this irregular spelling will happen in every single conjugation. So it's not like a car-gar-zar verb, which only changes in the yo form. These verbs change all the way through every single conjugation. Not only do they have a spelling change, but we have very specific conjugation endings that we use for these. We don't use a normal AR ending. We don't use a normal ER-IR ending. In fact, we actually kind of use a combination of both. So let's take a look at what verbs fall into these categories. So the first category we're going to talk about is category UV. And these verbs are andar, estar, tener. All of these verbs follow the UV category because they have a UV in the spelling change of the verb itself. Andar becomes anduv, estar, estuv, and tener, tuv. Now, we have a new set of endings that we have to remember, and these endings do not have any accent marks. So when we convert andar to anduv, we're going to add the new endings, anduve, anduviste, anduvo, anduvimos, anduvistes, anduvieron. Same thing for estar, estuve, estuviste, estuvo, estuvimos, estuvistes, estuvieron. Now a similar thing happens with category U verbs. Poder, poner, and saber all fall into the category U form. And so now these verbs, instead of having a UV that they have in common, they just change to U. Poder becomes pud, poner, pus, and saber, soup. Then we add these new endings that we've just learned. Pude, pudiste, pudo, pudimos, pudisteis, pudieron. Poner becomes puse, pusiste, puso, pusimos, pusisteis, pusieron. And the last category we have is a category I. There are two verbs that fall into this category because then the main part of the verb has a spelling change that involves an I. Querer and venir. Querer becomes quis, and venir becomes been. They use the same endings as a category UV and U, and so querer becomes quise, quisiste, quiso, quisimos, quisisteis, quisieron. So, the preterite is complicated because not only do we have normal AR, ER, IR verbs, we also have 5 irregulars, which we could probably handle. But now we're adding in an additional 3 different types, and they have new endings that don't look like the regular endings that we're used to. So the preterite becomes a little more complex because it has a variety of endings, and it has a variety of changes. So we really need to kind of practice and memorize how these verbs change and keep up with every element of the preterite. So let's look at some examples. Because we're going to be changing from the present tense into the preterite, let's take a look at how I would change yo me pongo una chaqueta. Me pongo comes from ponerse. Ponerse is a reflexive, so I have to transfer that reflexive pronoun. But poner happens to be a category U, so it becomes yo me puse una chaqueta. 2. Nico sabe jugar basketball. Sabe comes from the verb saber, which is a category U. Saber in the Nico form has to become supo. Nico supo jugar basketball. Tú no estás en clase comes from the verb estar. Estar is a category UV. So when we make it preterite, tú no estuviste en clase. Yo tengo una bicicleta comes from the well-known verb tener. Tener in the preterite becomes tuve because it's a UV category verb. Yo tuve una bicicleta. And finally, ellos quieren ir de vacaciones. Quieren comes from the verb querer. And remember, up to this point, I've told you there are no stem changers. So we've got to revert back to querer, recognize it as a category I, and change it to ellos quisieron ir de vacaciones. So it's really important to keep track of all elements of the preterite tense. There are so many different facets to the preterite tense, and we really need to remember all of them. So keep practicing, take notes, have the notes out while you do your practice, and let's see how much you've learned. See you in class.